From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is Matthew Barton. I'm the curator of the Recorded Sound section. Most of the time I'm down at the National Audiovisual Conservation Center in Culpeper, Virginia, about 60 miles southwest of here. But it's nice to get up here. I used to work in this building, though I get lost here now. Anytime I get an audience here, though, I like to ask, who's here for the first time in the Library of Congress? Anybody? Okay, a few? Okay, yeah. Welcome. Please come back soon. Don't be a stranger. It's here for you. So this event, I can't take much credit for helping to put it together. It's very much the brainchild of Allison and Tony from the Studs Terkel Archive, and I'll introduce everybody in a moment. I wanted to say something, though, about the project that we're working on with the Studs Terkel Archive in Chicago. This began a little over 7 years ago. Studs Terkel's recorded broadcast legacy amounts to about 7,000 reels of tape over 45 years. And I'm not going to go all technical on you, but I'll just say that as a recorded sound archivist, that period of time and that range of tape covers pretty much all of the archival problems that you can have with tape. But boy, is it ever worth it. And at this point, we're about 70% through with the processing, and we're about 60% digitally preserved. That is, 60% of those 7,000 files, over 4,000 of them, have been digitized. And you can hear them downstairs if you want to before you leave. Go down to LM 119, LM 119 in this building. Karen Fishman, our head of reference, should be back there by then. And we'll set you up with a pair of headphones, and you can listen to Studs Terkel. I particularly recommend that you listen to Studs Terkel's interview with Elliot Asinoff, author of 8 Men Out. And I'll just say a word or two generally about audio preservation. I kind of evangelize for it because I feel it's a neglected resource and, just a neglected treasure, countless treasures, really. And I was fortunate enough to know Studs Terkel slightly in that I worked for Alan Lomax, one of his very good friends, and met Studs through Alan, and then later, after Alan had retired due to a series of strokes, the archive was on the same floor of a building in New York with Studs' publisher, New Press, and Studs would visit and always ask about Alan. And one time, I actually got to bring the two of them together again. Really a lovely moment. Alan had aphasia, had difficulty speaking, but the joy was just so palpable. It was really wonderful to be together with the two of them. And we're very fortunate to have had Studs Terkel with us for so very long. We're very fortunate that he saw fit to archive what he was doing in the first place. Many people don't, even no matter how seriously they take their work in radio. It's an ephemeral thing. You finish with it and you're on to the next program. And I brought with me from very late in Studs' life, Touch and Go, this wonderful memoir. I've got a very short passage to read here, but it'll give you an idea of the things that are lost, but the things that can be saved. He's talking about the early 1950s when he's at a station, another Chicago station, not WFMT, working for a man named Red Quinlan. And he says, "I remember interviewing Battling Nelson. He was the lightweight champion way back. We're talking about 1906 during the San Francisco earthquake. He was there giving money to earthquake victims. A guy tips me off he's in Chicago and where to find him. Battling Nelson is in a seedy 40-watt bulb Ontario hotel room. I went with Hanson, the engineer. Nelson's wife is cackling as the old boy tries to remember certain events in his life, glory moments. Old Bat has a tremendous sheaf of papers and a ton of scrapbooks, photos, Nelson, the durable Dane, and the King of Denmark, etc. He opens it up and there are headlines, and he talks and there's his voice. Remember, he's from 1908, 1910, the kind of guy Hemingway wrote about. After Red Quinlan left, the new head dumped me. He did say, 'These tapes are yours if you want them.' I didn't take them. should have. Who the hell else would have battling Nelson's voice today? So thankfully, we don't have that voice, but we have so many others. And will you join me, please, in welcoming this wonderful panel. We have Allison Schein Holmes, archivist of the Studs Terkel Archive, Tony Macaluso, director of the same archive, Derek Goldman, drama teacher at Georgetown University, David Strathairn, actor, Oscar nominee and star of 8 Men Out, and John Sayles, director of 8 Men Out.
So thank you all for coming. We're going to dive into Studs baseball in America in just a few minutes, but first we're going to give you just a little more background on this magnificent thing called the Studs Terkel Radio Archive. And so first of all, thank you to the Library of Congress, because this would not be happening without all the amazing digitizing. The archive is being managed by Studs' old radio home, WFMT in Chicago, and the Chicago History Museum in a really special partnership. And of course, we'd also particularly want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has given really critical support for this project at a couple of key junctures, and especially give a call of thanks to John Parrish Petey, the chairman of the NEH, David Weinstein, program officer, who's been a great source of advice and wisdom. So quickly, I'll tell you what we've got planned for today. We could go on into great detail about what is the Studs Terkel Radio Archive. We're going to give you just a little bit of that, but then we're going to watch some clips of Studs, see a little bit of 8 Men Out, hear some readings, theatrical brought to life, and a few clips from Studs' programs specifically on baseball. But I'll mention, and then my colleague Allison will join to talk a little more about what the archive is. But essentially, when Studs retired from his daily radio show in 1997, again, he left behind this trove of tapes to the Chicago History Museum. The Library of Congress began their work a little more than a decade later, and the History Museum came back to Studs' old radio home now 5 years ago to say, do you have any thoughts on how to make all this accessible to the world? It's one thing to have tapes, even online, but how to make them appealing, how to make a new generation of listeners want to find out what's in there and listen to them. And so a long process began with help from the NEH and others of building this site. And then just over a month and a half ago, on Studs' birthday, May 16th, the whole thing went live at studsterkel.org. And so with beautiful photography, there'll be a remixing tool coming out soon where people can go in and remix audio, but also education programs we'll talk a bit more about in a second. A brand new podcast coming out in October called Bughouse Square with e-viewing, hosted by a phenomenal young poet, scholar, activist who will bring all this to a new generation. But today we're here specifically talking about Studs in baseball, and the archive is divided into about 60 categories, and really we could do a similar event on each one of those categories. It could be Studs in jazz, or Studs in feminism, or Studs in World War II. But today we're doing baseball, in part because of the fantastic exhibit across the street, which if you haven't seen, I definitely suggest going over right after this. But also Studs was a deep lover of baseball and all the cultural surroundings of it, the long conversation, the understanding, the nuances of the game, and one of the reasons that he had this role in John's film, I think, was because he was a deep baseball lover. But I just want to end my portion and then bring Allison up for a bit, is to say that Studs, though, when he was a kid, didn't play baseball. He was in Chicago. He actually was born in New York, but moved to Chicago when he was 8, and he had asthma and other health problems, and so he spent a couple of summers in a kind of sanitarium on Lake Michigan, on the Michigan side, listening to the radio, and that's when he first discovered politics and things like opera and other music, sitting there in bed, listening to baseball games as well, listening to the Republican Democratic Convention in 1920. And so Studs, despite his love of baseball, never really got to play baseball until he was 90 years old. And I'll tell you that story at the end of the whole event. You got to stick around to find out about Studs' Major League Baseball debut at the age of 90. But first, Allison, do you want to talk a bit about some of the facets of the archive? And I can jump in.
Maybe I can. There we go. Thanks, Tony. Oh, all right. Just a few quick facts, because Tony pretty much covered everything. When you do go to studsterkel.org, please know that there are a few ways that you can engage in a deeper level than typical radio archives. Is that we've got about 164 programs currently transcribed, with more coming down the pike. And while transcription is wonderful and great, what you can also do is share portions of the most meaningful bits across social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter that will allow people to come right back to that exact moment that you were just so excited about you had to tell everyone. Also, if you are an educator or know some educators that are looking for some exciting content to use to enhance their current lesson plans, we do have a classroom section of studsterkel.org where we currently have 3 different curriculum already put together, lesson plans, audio, everything right there ready for you to go, or your fellow educators, to go in to really have some fun with. There's learning-based ones, and then there's they're all learning. There's project-based ones that really will help give students a chance to have a deeper connection to history that sometimes we lose when we're reading it, but can definitely hear it and feel it when you hear the conversations with members of SNCC, with women's rights and labor rights movements. So anyway, we implore you to go to the website, have fun with it, enjoy. We are constantly adding to it, as Matthew said. They're continuing the digitization, so we will be adding more there. And if there's something that you're interested in and you don't see, feel free to drop me an email and we'll see what we can do for you. So welcome, and I hope you have fun listening to the talk on baseball and studs. Derek?
Great. Just a quick note, the program is probably going to last about an hour and 20 minutes, something like that, and we're going to leave lots of space at the end for questions and answers on any of the topics, so to John and David and others. So keep questions in mind. We're eager to hear some feedback from you all. All right.
Great. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. Yeah, as Tony mentioned, my name's Derek Goldman. I'm very, I can't imagine for me getting to talk about Studs, who's one of my great heroes and who I felt lucky to get to spend some time with towards the end of his life, and to talk about baseball and to be among heroes of mine like John and David, who has also become a friend and collaborator, but who I still think of as a hero of mine. These are my favorite topics, and I just will share. I think I'm going to do the least of the talking, but I wanted to just share a little bit about how my relationship with Studs felt particularly entwined with baseball. And as someone who's been a lifelong diehard baseball fan, it might open up just to sort of put on the table a couple of themes of how, at least for me, and I felt like I shared this with Studs, how the beautiful seriousness of everything baseball, and put it that way. So I was getting to know Studs in the last decade of his life in the 90s in Chicago. I'm a playwright and theater maker and had the opportunity to write a play about the Haymarket riots at Steppenwolf Theater. And Studs was sort of introduced to Studs, and he became the kind of go-to labor historian expert, who couldn't have a better person in the history of the world, I felt. But I got to spend some time with him, getting to know him as we were developing that play. And that was an interesting time in the baseball world because it was the mid to late 90s, and at least in Chicago, Sammy Sosa was, along with Mark McGuire, helped by various substances, as we now know, and tarnished by various substances, were shattering records. And that was a big part of the fodder for our time together and our conversations, even in those early moments. And I remember him using expressions like, skilled craftsmen plying their trade, talking kind of at that point, I think, ironically also about, in a certain way, about the way baseball had changed. But it was a source of connection. And I grew up in Boston, very near Fenway Park, as a lifelong diehard Red Sox fan. And this was still the period where neither the Red Sox nor the Cubs had broken their sort of almost century-long curse, and they were sort of, as many of you know, very kind of twinned franchises that had this kind of empathy across the American and the National League. So I ended up having the chance to adapt and direct Studs' book "Will the Circle Be Unbroken," which deals with death and mortality and loss. And we were developing that project a couple years later in 2003. And if anyone remembers the 2003 baseball season, it was a particularly interesting season to be thinking about the chances of the Red Sox and the Cubs breaking their respective curses. In fact, what happened is in October, in a sort of painfully twinned symmetry, the two teams were both 5 outs away from making the World Series. So we spent a lot of that year talking about the possibility of a Red Sox Cubs World Series, which was very real. They both had 3-run leads with 5 outs away from making the World Series, and neither team made it. The Cubs' probably most infamous moment in franchise history happened in Game 6 when a fan named Steve Bartman reached over and interfered with left fielder Moises Alou, and opened the door for the Florida Marlins to come back. And for the Red Sox, 2 nights later, manager Grady Little left Pedro Martinez in longer than any as the whole Red Sox nation screamed, take him out, he has nothing left. And Little at the time said, that's probably it for me as a manager, and of course he was correct. And the Red Sox went on to lose to the Yankees in Game 7 when Aaron Boone, now the Red Sox manager, hit a home run off of Tim Wakefield to send them against the Marlins to the World Series. So the following year, the Red Sox actually broke the 86-year-old curse, and in fact, just symmetry that I think is, whatever it means. October 17th, 2004 was the first public performance of Will the Circle Be Unbroken at Steppenwolf Theater, which is a very moving occasion with Studs there and in attendance. And as we entered the party that night at the place where the post-show party was, David Ortiz hit a 12th inning home run in Game 4 against the Yankees, which in what's now famously known by Red Sox as sort of the Dave Roberts game, to sort of send the Red Sox. Then won the next 3 games and went on to, it was the first time a team had come back from 3-0 to make the World Series, and they won the World Series in 2004. So that's some of the, and Studs and I, we shared and talked about this. We were living this connected to that project. So I'm going to just share a couple of very quick thoughts that I think may resonate through the theme of a couple of the readings that David and I have picked from the sort of Studs things that you'll hear that feel to me like they speak to why I feel like my love and reverence for Studs Terkel is so tied to my love and feelings about baseball. Tony alluded to one thing already, which is maybe the most obvious, which is that baseball is truly a conversationalist's game. The role of the vernacular and of from the vendors to the kind of rhythm of the game and the way it opens conversation, the nicknames that have existed across time. I think it's just like there's something about the oral nature of the game and the fans' role in that and the relationship to time that's unique to baseball. Another thing that's a theme that comes out a little bit in what we're going to hear, but I think is very deeply Studs, is baseball has a really interesting relationship between success and failure. It's the best teams. The sort of adage is every team loses 50 to 60 games and every team wins 50 to 60 games, and it's what teams do with the other 40 games that distinguishes, the best from the worst. And similarly, a 300 hitter is a great hitter and succeeds 30% of the time, and a 200 hitter is a terrible hitter and succeeds 20% of the time, more or less. So I think that's actually really something that Studs. There's something about the idea that like everybody fails and everybody succeeds, and people and there's a lot of both, and you get different turns to bat in a sense, kind of that feels like something that connects people to baseball. Studs, as everyone I think knows, was a huge aficionado of music, and his work itself is hugely musical and attuned to music, and a lot of the credit for that goes to amazing people he worked with, like the incredible editor Sidney Lewis, like the sort of sense of musicality of the human voice and structure and improvisation and relationship to jazz. And I think even I sometimes think in the books that there's a way of thinking about the passages as almost like innings in a certain kind of way. So I think we could go on and you'll pluck other themes, but I wanted to sort of begin by sharing some of how, for me, and this is part of why it feels really special to be here, these things all feel like they get to the deepest core of what I love about Studs. So I'm going to hand it over to David, who's going to read a couple passages over the course of our time together, but this first one sort of begins talking about, it's Studs talking about his relationship to famous baseball owner of the Chicago White Sox, Bill Veeck.
To me, Bill Veeck was the last of the independent spirits in sports, certainly baseball. Before he died, we were sitting at Myler's Pub in Chicago, and he would say, "We're gone. It's corporate America." And he was referring to the Steinbrenners, et cetera. Corporate America is taking over. It's not as personal as it was. What I love about Bill Veeck is the way he analyzed baseball. He says, we are a country of losers to a great extent, but certain moments we experience victory. Let's savor that. For example, the exploding scoreboard. A corny thing. Comiskey Park, when he was general manager of the Sox, the electric scoreboard. And the team was horrible. The team was rotten. But the home team gets a home run and the crowd goes crazy. He got that from William Saroyan's play, The Time of Your Life. It's about the Depression. There's a bar in San Francisco. All the losers are there. There's a kid playing a pinball machine. He never wins. One day he hits the jackpot. The pinball machine, the flags go up, the band plays Dixie, and it's glorious. That's the electric scoreboard. The losers can enjoy a moment of triumph. He believed in that very much. The Chicago White Sox were a blue-collar team. South Side, steel mills, Irish to a great extent. It was the park of losers ever since the Black Sox, Joe Jackson and the others. Now, why Babe Ruth is the greatest athlete? Well, first of all, it's from my vantage point. I'm 86 as we have this conversation, going on 87, and so naturally a certain period of my life, the period of the 1930s, and for that matter the 20s, I was a kid, a young man. It was the Babe who saved baseball. Remember that, the Black Sox Scandal. God, that was it for baseball. And then they bring in that phony, the Commissioner K.M. Landis, and they punish the ones up front, the ball players. And of course, you exonerate the others who are really responsible and made these guys culpable. So there's baseball in terrible form, and along comes this Paul Bunyan-esque figure, this guy, this man-child, the Babe. George Herman Ruth, the Sultan of Swat. Bang! And you see him circling those bases with the skinny, delicate legs, tripping almost feminine-like. We know off the field he was quite a colorful figure. He had a gargantuan appetite in every aspect of life, but the Babe represented, well, the word is eponymous, more than synonymous. When you say baseball, you say Babe Ruth, of course. The World Series at Cubs Field, and they're booing him. He's facing Cubs pitcher Charlie Root. Now, here comes the story. Now, everybody I know says they saw the game. That means the place could have seated 1 million people. You've heard this many times. I saw that game. Some point toward center field, some point toward right field. Apparently, he did point somewhere, and he hit the ball where he pointed. That seems to be the truth. I mean, I could lie and say, of course, I was one of the million who was at Cubs Park that day. And invariably, you'll find fans who create a moment they heard about and they want to be part of it again. Again, we're losers, so it's a natural logic that I was there, and you half believe them. Wait till next year, the phrase of all sportcasters. It's waiting for Godot, in a way. The Chicagoans are Vladimir and Estegron, Didi and Gogo, the two tramps rolled into one, the two heroes of Samuel Beckett's play. We are waiting for Godot, waiting forever, but at least there's hope. That, in a sense, is Chicago.
So we'll go and hear a little bit of Studs from the archive. This is Studs with Lauren Ritter, author of In the Glory of Their Times, so just a brief passage.
And I was locked out, so give me a second. I didn't want it to make a noise while David was reading, so that is why it is not unlocked.
I think all the clips we'll be playing today, just a handful of them, are available on the website. Among the many, many. We can talk a little more, or we can jump ahead and come back if you want a little more time too.
Hang on. Sorry, this is not my machine, so I'm dealing with other people's login information.
While we're waiting for this, one of the things that Studs like to talk about, and when you hear any of this audio, or what we just heard here from David too, is this concept of the feeling tone. Studs had lots of great definitions for describing what he did in terms of when it was oral history or radio or performance, which is his own thing to itself. But Studs like to talk about the feeling tone being this, the way I think of it is kind of the quality you get in somebody's voice that's beyond the literal meaning of their words, but the kind of the way that they sigh or laugh or even light a cigarette and inhale or pause in a conversation that gives you a sense of what it felt like to live through a certain experience. And when you listen to some of these programs, I think it's one of the things that's exciting about the audio archive is that it's not just hearing history, seeing it written down on the page or even visually, but getting that feeling tone. That there's a program when Studs is talking with a group from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who had been doing lunch counter protests in the South, and they were interviewing Studs, fairly young people. They'd been in prison and dealt with the dogs and so forth. And in programs like that, you hear the fear in their voices as they're describing things, but then gradually, as they sing together a little bit, how the fear shifts from fear to pride and a certain kind of triumph. And that's the kind of thing that if you're just seeing it written on the page, you just don't get it all, but in an audio archive like this, and particularly exciting when you think about students. We can move on and come back to this a little bit later if you want, but we'll see if Allison comes back. We'll jump back into things. But just last week I was in Ireland talking about the archive to a big oral history conference. We were talking particularly about the Cold War and radio and how you communicated things. And there's a program in the archive when Studs was in England in 1962 visiting the home, the cottage of the wizened philosopher Bertrand Russell, fall of 1962, on the day that the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. And Bertrand Russell, at the age of 90, was the point person for leading the anti-nuclear movement. And there was Studs with his portable Ure tape recorder talking with Bertrand Russell, opening the conversation while the clock dings in the background, saying something along the lines of, "Is that the clock of doom striking midnight or just an ordinary clock?" And the phones ringing throughout the interview, and just the sense of being in a moment in history, sitting there wondering if the world was possibly facing nuclear annihilation, and hearing that voice of Bertrand Russell, wizened voice, trying to bring some calm to this clearly terrifying moment. So just a few of my favorite examples. And do you want to go and jump into another reading, and then we can jump back to Lauren Ritter. So let's move ahead.
Want to introduce this one? Yeah. So this is we have 3 readings total. This is one of them is in a different voice than Studs, but one that I think is mirrors. It's the voice of Hank Ettinger, who's featured in the book Will the Circle Be Unbroken, and was a friend of Studs and a retired printer at the time, and kind of a lifelong barfly denizen, larger-than-life personality. And this is, again, the context for the book, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? If you don't know, it is about mortality and relationship to death, which here you'll see for Hank is quite tied to his connection to, or at least a question about baseball.
My family consisted of 11 children. I'm number 10. The first 4 died in infancy from scarlet fever. The other 7 were remarkable in their survival. I'm a good example of that because I'm now 88 years old. I don't have any troubles physically. I'm drinking my beers every day at the Old Town Ale House and Billy Goats, and I sleep well. I can feel the approach of Alehauser's disease. Oh, that's my name for it. The loss of certain memories that were usually so clear in my mind. Has there ever been one single tiny bit of evidence that there's a hereafter? Never once. There is no evidence. There is never anybody that comes back. The earth is here. We're here. The animals are here. The birds are here. And then what do you need God for? What for? When you die, you go back to the earth from which you arose. You're dead, and that's the end. Kaput. People try to convert me, try to get me back to religion. One was a bright young man from Moody Bible Institute. He accosts me at North and Wells and hands me a pamphlet. I said, "No thanks, I happen to be an atheist." He says, "You can't be an atheist." And I says, "I can't? Well, I figure I've been an atheist for about 50, 60 years. Why can't I be?" He says, "Who made you?" And I said, "You mean to say that you attained the age of 25 and nobody explained the facts of life to you yet?" He took his pamphlet back, but he laughed and he got a kick out of it. I ask people, do you believe in the Noah's Ark story? 2 each of everything? Yes, the Bible says it's so. Well, I says, well then tell me, what did the anteaters have for the second meal? And they're dumbfounded. You know, there are 2 ants and 2 anteaters. Now, I have absolutely no fear of death. I know that one of these days, poof, I'm done, I'm gone. But I'll live on in the memories of a hell of a lot of people that I affected. Because I feel that if anybody should go to heaven, it should be me. I've spent my whole life working for the laboring man, for farmers, for the poor, against war, against racism. I just happen to think that I'm a saint. In fact, I know when I'm going to die. I made up my mind, say 10 years ago. I'm going to die in the year 2008, around November. And I figure when that year comes, I'm going to borrow money, sell everything I have, which is nothing, accumulate as much money as I can, and bet the whole thing that the Cubs are going to win the World Series. But it would be 100 years since they did, and I figure they have to do it once in a century, and when I get that money, I'm going to throw the biggest party at the Ale House and at Billy Goats, and that'll be enough.
So just a quick footnote, as you probably know, the Cubs did not win the World Series by 2008, although they've won it since in 2016. But it's interesting. But Studs passed away on October 31st, 2008. So when I now hear that passage about November of 2008, and of course it was just days before the election of Barack Obama, who he knew well, and so it's that November 2008 date still resonates in different ways 10 years later than it did when Hank spoke it.
Should we want to move ahead to John talking about 8 Men Out? We'll get to audio at the end. That'll be the
Yeah,
Okay, great.
I had met Studs. I did his radio show for our movie Return of the Stalker 7, which David was in, and had heard him on radio and kind of knew who he was. I was a big fan of Nelson Algren's, and he and Nelson Algren, the novelist, were really tight. And my first meeting with Studs, I felt like, oh my God, I'm not going to get a word in edgewise. I thought this guy asked questions, but he was an archive. He was an archive with 2 legs, And if you got him started on anything, he would start to free associate. So one day on the set, the newsroom set that we had, there was a picture of photograph of Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey. I saw Jack Dempsey in the Drake Hotel once. We had a meeting at the Drake. There was a wonderful bellhop at the Drake Hotel. And then he talked for half an hour about the bellhop and maybe never get back to Jack Dempsey. So I figured I'm cooked. I'm going to be on the show. This guy's just going to talk, and I hope he saw the movie. And then the minute the radio show started, he was like a chess master. He started down a road. Where's he going with this? And sure enough, at 10 of the hour, he'd bring it back to where he started. He always did this thing of writing down about 2/3 of the way through the show the name of a song, and he'd hand it to a production assistant who'd go back to his engineer, and that was the song that was going to be played as the show ended. And for our Secaucus 7 show, it was John Prine singing Illegal Smile. Perfect song for that particular thing. So I knew Studs, and I had written the screenplay for 8 Men Out 13 years before I got to make it. So it was a long period. And I had gotten to that project because I had read a long prose poem by Nelson Algren, something for opening day, and he talked about the individuals on the team, and then he footnoted Elliot Azanoff's book 8 Men Out. And we eventually got an option on Elliot's book, and I got to make it. So it was this long process where, as I say, I started out with Martin Schein at third base and ended up with Charlie Sheen in center field. But the one guy I'd always had in my mind, there were these two sports writers who were the guys who kind of blew the story, because other sports writers, they didn't want to talk, they knew what was going on, they didn't want to talk, it's bad for baseball, or they had been taking so much of Charles Comiskey's free lunch and free booze over the years that they felt like, I can't betray Kami, and write about what's going on with the players. Just keep a lid on it. It'll be bad for baseball. But Ring Lardner, who had been a sports writer for a long time and was covering that, and another guy, Hugh Fullerton, were the guys who said, this is something fishy is going on here, and we're gonna get to the bottom of it, and we're gonna write about it. And got all kinds of flack, and they were considered like anarchists for doing this. And the descriptions of them were Ring Lardner, who was this tall, thin guy, who had a very dry sense of humor and seemed kind of like a funeral director. And then this little cigar stub of a man, Hugh Fullerton, were always this Mutt and Jeff act walking down the street together. I'm 6'4", and Studs was not. So one of the problems in shooting scenes with us was getting us in the same frame. When we were still, I would either sit down or I would stand with my legs spread really far apart, kind of come down to Studs. So when we had to walk together, we just had to widen the lens. And I also knew that Studs had been a buddy of Bill Veeck's. And so I figured, well, he must be, a Cubs fan by now, and he's interviewed all these baseball guys. So Studs said, oh yeah, Hugh Fullerton, I knew that, and I was around for the Black Sox, and it was like a pall over Chicago, this awful history. And then he got into Kennesaw Mountain Landis and how he put the wrong people in jail, and then he ended up, being the czar of baseball forever, and the inequity of that. So the first day that Studs was on the set, he was telling stories and everything, and he had a great mind for his lines and everything. No problem with the lines. The real problem was when he would finish his lines, he'd freeze with cigar in midair, and then wait for another line, and then he'd say his line and he'd freeze. And I said, Studs, this isn't radio. Oh, God, that's right, that's not radio. Because he had, as a young man, done radio plays. And he said, I always got the Edward G. Robinson part, and I always got to hold a cigar and say, yeah. And it actually took him very many takes, and I had to remind him many times, this is not radio. You have to, pretend you're listening to the other people, even if you're really just waiting for your next line. And I did his show a couple more times. He did a novel, Union Dues, that I had done, and I came in, and I figured, well, okay, it's a long book, and I'm sure he has researchers and everything, and I sit down with him, and there are probably in a 375-page book, there's 100 little markers. He's annotated my book. And so as we're going through, and he's color-coded the annotations, so the red ones are the first ones to get to. I mean, just amazing, and so comfortable in the conversation. There's no ums and ers, but he was this magician at drawing people out, and he knew kind of where he wanted to take you, where he wanted you to lead the audience to reveal yourself, to reveal the book. One of the things in the archive is his interview with Elliot Azanoff. Elliot Azanoff was a guy, he'd been a minor league ball player. He basically, because he wasn't great and because he was Jewish, he didn't get to, and World War II came around, he didn't get to be a major league ball player, but he probably could have hung on if he hadn't been Jewish. He got blacklisted. Eventually, he found that his name showed up first when he got his much redacted stuff from the FBI. His first appearance on their list was for signing a petition outside of Yankee Stadium saying it was time for them to have a black ball player. That got you on J. Edgar Hoover's shit list at that time. And then he married Marlon Brando's sister, and she got blacklisted, basically as a diversion, so they wouldn't go after her brother. And pretty soon he was blacklisted. And he started tracking down these baseball players. And he talked to these guys just before they died, many of them just before they died. And they all had their own version of the thing. But he wrote this, and Nelson Algren was kind of one of the people who got him started on it. But their talk is an incredible one. His nickname among his writer friends was God's Angry Man. And he was late in the blacklist, so he was a front for a couple of years for other guys who had already been blacklisted, except he was so cantankerous. He went in for one writer and he started arguing with the producer. Those are the stupidest notes I've ever seen, and got fired when it wasn't even his project. And Studs was kind of the benign version of, they had this very similar past, and Studs was kind of the benign, who could get along with anybody. And Elliot was the guy who would find a way to start a war with almost anybody.
I just wanted to add one thing. When John mentioned how Studs was kind of a chessman and knew that he could make friends with anybody, the one first-hand experience I had during the shooting of the film was sitting at lunch with Studs with a bunch of some of the extras, and we were shooting in Indiana, a red state, and we were sitting across the table from some locals from there, and Studs just got them into conversation. And just started kind of peeling away what they thought about the present state of the Union, and just because of his sort of elfish charm and how his gift of being, of interviewing somebody, it came to pass that all these guys at the other table started realizing or thinking they had a kindred spirit in which they could bring out every vehement, vitriolic thing they had against the other side. And there's Studs, a socialist guy who's just pulling this stuff from them. And then lunch was, and we're all sitting around taking a lesson in this skill and wondering, how is he getting these people to be so free with volunteering what they think. And then lunch is over and we leave, and he sits back and he says something to the effect that it's not all that hard to get everybody's dirty laundry on the line.
Okay, so now thank you to the IT team here for helping us out. We're going to play a short clip. Thank you. about Studs talking about his experience being on set, and then do you want to introduce the Ritter clip before or after?
We'll do after.
Okay, all right.
And just what you said. That's how the phrase existential hero came.
That's
from.
right.
And
That's right.
This
Yeah.
dry flaws in him, nonetheless seeing flaws in the other.
That's right. So true, isn't it? Yeah. You acted on stage. You've acted in film. What differences did you note of interest?
When film, just one. Now, two films. The second one is funny. The first was John Sayles about the Sox baseball scandal.
8 Men Out.
Yeah, 8 Men Out. He played Ring Lardner. He himself, John Sayles. He's a dead ringer. Ring Lardner Jr. was covering some of the shooting of it. He's just like the old man. And I was playing Huey Fullerton, an actual guy who covered it. So we were a chorus. But the second movie, and I have 2 lines I can tell you about this. Years ago, there was a soap. I was in TV. We'll come to that in a minute. Chicago TV, a thing called Studs Place. The director was named Dan Petrie, who finally became a movie director, directing Jane Fonda in a movie called The Doll Maker. The Doll Maker is based on a Southern novel. It's a very good one. In which she plays the wife of an Appalachian guy who gets a job during World War II in a war plant in Detroit, but they shot the film in Chicago. And so she comes out of the depot with 4 little kids into a taxi cab. And the 2 lines for the cab driver. So Dan Petrie says to Jane Fonda, you know, I directed Studs' show in Chicago. He's in Chicago doing it, but have fun. He'll do 2 lines. He's very funny. And she says, I know Studs. We've been on the same platform together many times during the anti-Vietnam stuff. So we do the scene. 2 lines. I must point out, I have never sat behind a wheel in my life. I don't drive a car. I have no idea. I really don't. I know a wheel is round. There's a gear. You step on it. You don't step on it. I know that. That's all I know. And Dan Petrie knew this. So I'm sitting and I do the cab scene, the 2 lines, and it's funny. And then he says, now you pull out, drive away, and you fade out. I said, what the hell are you talking about? And he said,
Do you want to now do they continue on talking? Do you?
Yeah, let's hear a little bit of just a very brief clip here now. So this is Studs with Lauren Ritter, the author of The Glory of Their Times. So it's just a minute or so to hear the voice from the radio archive itself.
And it was a primitive thing just beginning, and there was no money in it. The fields were rough. They had rocks in them. Very often the players went out with their own rake and raked up their position. The fans were a part of the game. They were on the field half the time, and the umpire shooed them off, and they run back again. And the players and the fans were one. Now there's a very stern railing separates the playing field and the grandstand, and neither one can go on the other's territory.
I think this is worth dwelling upon. Something has happened. Quite obviously, we speak of a certain game that kids in every small town, everywhere, he was the culture hero, the baseball player. Of course, Cobb. Of course, a man like Crawford, a man like Rube Marquardt, and the very colorful and eccentric Rube Waddell. But there's a little difference. Even though some of the players today may be equally as good, some of the great ones like Mays.
Baseball took hold quickly in this country. It was a country it was a sport I think that was very well suited for late 19th century America. And it took hold very quickly. It really just got started in about 1880, 1890, and by 1910, 1915, the top-notch ball player had a position in American society in the mind of the kid, not in the mind of the grown-up, in the mind of the kid that was unequaled. Or maybe the heavyweight champion of the world. Maybe John L. Sullivan also was on that pinnacle, but nobody else.
But there was this rapport between audience, even physically, you say, they went on the field. There was this rapport. They were not watching automata at work,
Oh, no.
individual
the
men.
The book is full of, even as late as the 20s, when Paul Wainer, who was the youngest in the book, who played the latest, even as late as the 20s, Paul talked to the people in the right field bleachers. He talked to the fans. There was a oneness inside of the stadium that didn't stop at the railings.
One thing that happened in the 1919 World Series that I didn't have enough money at the time, because it was before CGI and we were having a hard time getting extras, is Comiskey was such a skinflint and so into making money that after he sold all the seats there were 9 World Series games scheduled that year, and they didn't go all the full 9, but it was going to be 9 games. He sold standing room in the outfield. So there were about 300 people in left field, and they had 2 ushers holding a rope to keep them back against the wall. And so, of course, when it was a ground rule double if you hit into that area. So, of course, when a Chicago guy hit a fly ball there, they would push forward and bring the wall in. And then when a Cincinnati guy hit one, they would back up against the wall and give their guy a chance to catch it. So it was a much more personal kind of thing. And you're talking to guys throughout the game. There was no hiding them.
So then we're going to look at just a little clip from the film, and then another reading. And
find the clip.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Oh, we will. So let's go on to the last reading there, and then we'll bring the clip up if we find it, and then hear a little more Studs. But then we want to open things up and get questions from you all as well. So anything you want to say to?
Do you want to
set
do
this up?
just a thought on the?
Yeah.
Do we have the audio? Roger Kahn, Jackie Robinson clip.
We
Should
can
we
play
do?
that while they're looking.
Why don't we do that before the
Okay.
reading, and then we can open it out
Perfect.
if we don't have.
Oh, great. That sounds
Yeah.
good.
I think that's
So
a
this
better
is
order.
baseball writer Roger Kahn talking about Jackie Robinson. What more can you say?
It's a book about certain men who happen in the glory moments of their lives to have been baseball players. It's about skilled craftsmen at a certain moment in their lives and what happened to them after the skill had gone and the glory had gone. So what happens as humans about certain people together at a certain moment. And you said integrated, so naturally the catalytic figure here is Jackie Robinson.
Jackie's just a tremendous man and overlooked now, I think, generally by society. People forget. Let me say some of the things that Jackie had to endure within the bounds
What
of
was
taste.
the year?
The year was, this is the 25th anniversary. This opening day will be the 25th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's first game in the major leagues. A black cat was loosed
1947.
1947, opening day. He went hitless. A black cat was loosed on the field, and Jack walked over and picked up the animal and stroked its fur. Watermelon. Shoes were held up, and they shined these. He went up to bat in St. Louis, and somebody said, "No wonder you can't get a decent shine in St. Louis anymore." John Kieran described this as the subtle wit so characteristic of ball players, with some irony years ago. The Cardinals were going to strike. The strike was broken by enterprising newspaper work. The Dodgers themselves petitioned, and we were not talking then about scatter-site housing, about integrated schools, about anything. We were talking about the right of a man to play in the infield of a Major League Baseball team. And I think it's probably hard for young people to realize what a flaming issue this was. And so as the times have changed, and Jack is a Republican, he seems conservative to many young militants, works for Nelson Rockefeller on occasion. And I said to him one day we were having lunch, I said, "Jack, you've become conservative." And he said, "I have not become conservative. I am exactly what I always was, but the times have changed around me."
That's interesting. So the young, today, Jackie Robinson, conservative, the young militants look upon him as somewhat of a Tom, yet forgetting what he did, quite incredible thing.
Some Tom.
But at the same thing, he's saying the times have altered considerably. You see, all he was is this man who was a conservative politically wanted to follow his craft.
Great.
If I could.
Yeah, please.
Hi. Yeah. The sound archivist in me. I'm just going to break continuity for a moment and go back to Lawrence Ritter. I suspect most of you know who Lawrence Ritter was and what he did, but I just want to make sure for anyone who doesn't, because it's really singular. In the early 60s, I think, he went around and recorded interviews with as many early baseball players as he could find. And this became the basis of his book, The Glory of Their Times, which is a marvelous book. And those recordings, thankfully, and this is the archivist speaking in, those recordings, thankfully, have been archived. They all survive. There was even a record album that came out in the 60s, and you can probably find some of these things online. So a plug for Lawrence Ritter and what he did, that book, those recordings.
Right. It's my favorite. It's my best baseball book, I think. It's a beautiful book. This is the third of our readings, and it's so Studs, as we've said, did not live to see the Cubs winning the World Series, but he did live to see the White Sox win the World Series, which was a team, as you've heard a little bit already, that in some ways was closer to his heart and deeper in his heart. And this last one is kind of woven from some of Studs' writings. He was looked to around that time to sort of comment on what was happening with the White Sox, and that sort of opened out, as it always did with Studs, into some other commentary. So this is from that period.
It's a possibility the Cubs and the White Sox in the World Series. The thought is overwhelming. It's happened before, and you could look it up. 1906, the Sox won. Of all that has happened, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, the war against fascism, the Cold War, McCarthyism, the mad adventure in Southeast Asia, our own time of great bewilderment, the Cubs and the White Sox in the World Series would be the most unimaginable. I'm working on my memoirs. It's the last thing I'll do, if I can finish it, before I check out. I'm going to be 94 soon, so if I make it a year, I've got it made. I was raised as a Giants fan in New York. I was 8 years old when I came here in 1920. I was a John McGraw fan. John McGraw was for blacks in baseball. You know that? He tried to pass off a couple of blacks as Cubans. After a while, I became a Sox fan. How could you not root for a team that after the 1919 scandal was so bad? You had to root for them. Earl Sheely, first base, had a wooden leg almost. And an outfielder named Smead Jolly. How could you not root for a team with an outfielder named Smead Jolly? The Cubs have been a legend for years. Nothing to do with baseball. You have to understand that. The Cubs' popularity had nothing whatsoever to do with baseball. It's a place to come to, as they say the air show is, or the auto show, or the art institute. It's a place to be at. And many have come from suburbs and nearby towns. It's not really baseball. It's a place to be at. And we see that with the bimbos and the louts and the Bud Lights. After the game, you ask them, who did the Cubs play? What was the score? They shake their heads. It's not about baseball. It's about having been to a place to be. You're talking to an old guy who's a curmudgeon. Was I an athlete? Oh, God, no. I was the worst athlete ever. I'd fall off bicycles. You know who was a great story? Mo Berg. Now, he could catch. He was so-so, but he was a linguist. He worked in the Army to do some decoding. He could speak about 7 languages, so one of the writers wrote, he could speak in 7 languages, but couldn't catch in one. Now, I don't want to glorify the old days because they weren't that good either, but when you went to see the Sox, at least it was a ball game. I'm not saying Sox fans are brighter than Cub fans. They're not. Well, neither one is. I'll never forget this. I was sitting with Bill Veeck in the Bard's room, the dining room at the old Comiskey Park. It was about 2 weeks after he hired Larry Doby as manager. Remember, he had Larry as the first black player for the Indians, and then he managed the Sox. It was 2 weeks, and the Sox were losing more games than they were winning. So there's a call, and he answers the call. He's looking at me and saying, "Oh, Mrs. Meyerhoff," or whatever her name was. "You think I should fire Larry Doby? It's only 2 weeks. We've only played about 10 games. Oh, no, I know. It's not race." And he raises his eyes to the ceiling. "Oh, it's not race at all. No, I realize that." The 1919 Black Sox Scandal. Buck Weaver, third baseman, did not take part in it. He didn't inform on the other guys. The 8th guy kicked out of should have been Sox owner Charles Comiskey, the way he exploited the players. It made them a natural for a guy like Arnold Rothstein, the gambler who fixed the 1919 World Series. I have a friend, 91 like me, who wants to live to 2008 because he thinks the Cubs and the White Sox may meet in the World Series to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Cubs winning the series. At least we can dream. It's over the rainbow. We're all Judy Garlands. Do saucers fly? Do fiddlers play on rooftops?
So let's take some questions. All right. Do we want to pass it? And we don't have a mic we can pass to. Okay, we'll repeat the question then. Great.
Well, thank you all. I just want to put in a plug for Ring Lardner, who was not just a reporter, but he wrote some of the most marvelous stories about baseball ever. And he's largely forgotten now, unfortunately, but especially Alibi Ike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ring Jr., his son, I got to know him a little bit. We invited him to the set, and I said, there was a scene where I was playing Ring Lardner in it, and I asked him afterwards what it was like to see somebody play his father, and he said, uncomfortably familiar, which I took as a compliment. But yeah, he was a great writer. He never quite wrote novels. He wrote short stories. He wrote musicals, and he was he was a friend of most of those ball players, and but he was a straight guy. He was so troubled by the immorality of it, and he felt like they had let down their public. And he always was very uncomfortable with this relationship with Comiskey and free drinks for all the reporters. And some of that, the story about how he developed his style of writing, because Hemingway was a big fan of Ring Lardner's. And one of the things he liked about Ring Lardner's, he felt like he was one of the most successful and few American writers after Mark Twain who wrote in vernacular. And he started writing in this voice that you hear in You Know Me, Al, and some of these other stories. He traveled with both the Cubs and the White Sox and went on some of the road games with them. And he'd be on the train with them and stuff like that. And he noticed that he'd stay in the same hotel. There was this one player who always sat next to him at breakfast. And he started to realize there's something weird. He always orders what I order. Exactly. And he started ordering some kind of exotic things, and the guy would order the same thing. And then he realized the guy's illiterate. And I'm a big breakfast eater, and he just figures, well, I'll read the menu. Oh, I'll have the same he does. Or you just repeat the thing. So it kind of was obvious the guy thought, well, Ring must know that, but we're not going to talk about it. And one day the guy came to him and said, Ring, I want to play a joke on my wife. And I'm going to tell her that I'm learning how to type, but I don't really know how to type. So I'm going to dictate letters to you, and you type them up like I wrote them. And he realized the guy misses his wife and wants to write to her, and he can't do it because he's illiterate. And so he went through this charade, and every couple of days the guy would dictate it. And the guy was not very educated, and he made a lot of grammar mistakes. And Ring said, I'm going to spell like he could spell, if he could spell at all. And that was where that voice originally came from, was from this illiterate guy dictating to Ring and him saying, this guy's a great storyteller, but I'm going to tell it in his voice.
And there's a really wonderful, really enthralling interview with Ring Lardner Jr. in the Studs Audio Archive. We may get to a clip of that at the end. We'll see. Okay, we'll start left and work our way in the middle here. So, yep.
I was thrilled that footage of the 1919 World Series surfaced. He was rescued from the Yukon. It's a whole story in itself. But I was wondering what other audiovisual record, if any, of the 1919 series exists.
There was very, very little at the time, and it was mostly in newsreels. You have to figure in 1919, in the movie you see people listening to crystal sets. So radio hadn't even really started. A couple years from them, for the first many, many years, ball games were not broadcast live. It was two guys getting a ticker tape. And there's famous stories of Ronald Reagan when other guys, when he did it, when the ticker tape would break down, they'd invent, well, the manager's going out to the mound again, and it looks like it may rain, and and they'd have to stall, and they would have sound effects for a home run and cheers and things like that. So there just wasn't that much film, and it came from the archives of the newsreels, and apparently there was this stuff, up frozen under a building that had been a movie theater or something like that, or had been converted into a movie theater whenever the film got up during the gold rush. And there's some interesting, including this bizarre thing that somebody flew a plane over Game 2 and dropped a dummy of a ball player from it, and people thought, oh my God, he's gonna die, and they actually were warned about that, and so that was one of the things that they got. But it was amazing to see that after we had made the movie, and we felt like, geez, our uniforms look really pretty good.
Just a general remark about what survives of early radio. Even if games had been broadcast in 1919 or in the 1920s, we probably wouldn't have anything of them because very little radio from before 1935 survives. The 1934 World Series recordings of that do exist, but there was no easy way to record radio at any length more than a few minutes until about 1935. And from that point on, we do have a lot, but there's hardly any radio survives from before 1935.
And I'll just say, if people want an internal experience of what it was like to be a 9-year-old kid watching the 1919 White Sox, I recommend Nelson Algren's wonderful prose poem, Chicago City on the Make, which has some great passages about that. All right, we'll jump over here on the aisle.
This isn't too much off topic, but I'm a big fan of character actors, and John Anderson was in Eight Men Out, and I've never heard any stories about him.
Yeah, John Anderson, he's one of those guys, you'll recognize him. I had seen him in a lot of movies. Big, tall guy with a long face from New England. He was a St. Louis Cardinals fan, actually. And he just looked a lot like Landis. He looked like Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and he knew it. The best story, I think Hal Holbrook told you this story, is he was sitting at a table with Hal Holbrook and a couple other actors, and they were actually talking about that they'd all played Lincoln at one point. He had that long face, and with a little beard, he really looked like Lincoln. And some guy came over to the table and said, "So Lincoln?" And one of them said, "Well, yeah, I played him on stage, but John here played him in a TV movie and everything." And somebody else said, "Well, and I did a traveling one-man show with him." I said, "No. Who owns the Lincoln that was my car?" But terrific guy, and look him up. He's in every other great Western that you've watched, and really cool guy.
How about the gentleman in the back with the red shirt?
On the theory that history is made every day, has anybody written or recorded the history of Spanish-speaking players?
I actually think that's just starting, and some of it is that the Hispanic language stations are relatively new here, but they, those were incredible fans. And I think the technology didn't catch up with those radio stations as quickly as it did here. So the earliest guys, there's very little of Roberto Clemente, for instance, on radio. There's a bit of him on TV, but he was alone in Pittsburgh for a while. There wasn't even much of a Hispanic community at that time.
Yeah, one of the jewels of our recorded sound collection is the NBC collection, which starts in 1935, and it's tens of thousands of hours of every kind of radio there was, not just sports. And NBC had a Spanish language service, and they had a man doing Spanish play-by-play named Buck Cannell. And he actually recorded an album in the 50s. It was like a baseball game kind of album with the different outcomes and so on. I've been trying to, we don't have any in our collection that I've ever found. I've been trying to find recordings of Buck Cannell calling games. You know, if anybody's got them, please come see me. Because he was the voice of baseball in much of Latin America and in the Caribbean. And ball players who came up in the 50s and 60s all talk about hearing Buck Cannell do calls in their home countries. So, you know, that's one of my, you know, top 10, you know, most elusive items is Buck Cannell and other Spanish broadcasters. It would really be great to get that in because it's a huge part of baseball history.
We had a gentleman in a green shirt who had a question back here.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I believe, although in the film Ring Lardner is there, I think Christy Mathewson actually was with Hugh Fullerton during the actual writing, and Gene Carney wrote a book called Burying the Black Sox, which came out about 10 years ago, and you know, in it he talked about how Fullerton really didn't have the power to bring the truth out. All he could really do was rail against Van Johnson, and I think there's a great line in the book about how he really just had the word of gamblers and these sort of dirty politicians, and I was wondering if, you know, Studs ever sort of, you know, detailed any stories he had about, you know, getting these sort of stories from players and sort of like the underworld, the seedy underworld.
You know, when I talked to him about his own experience with him, the guy he talked about the most was the guy that John Cusack played. Buck was a guy who hung around Chicago. You know, he was banned from baseball. He had not taken any money. He had just not ratted his friends out. He'd been at one meeting and he said, "This doesn't sound good to me," and he left. And then he ended up for years trying to get reinstated, you know, when he could still play, and then even after get his record cleared. He ended up coaching girls softball in Chicago. So he was somebody that Studs would run into a lot. Studs didn't know, you know, he had heard of Hugh Fullerton but had never met him. Christy Mathewson actually had a lot of power because he was a former baseball and he was considered kind of a saint. He had gone over after World War I and been exposed to poison gas and had kind of ruined his health. And so he was this kind of sainted guy, and so he was untouchable. You know, if he said something in the press, nobody could really come after him. He wasn't just some sports writer who might even be Jewish. And a lot of the reaction against both Lardner's articles and Hugh Fullerton articles were very anti-Semitic. They were just, well, this is what, you know, you let Jews near baseball, this is what happened, even though none of the players were Jewish.
I don't know if somebody mentioned Mike Royko earlier, but I just wondered, did he and Studs Terkel know each other? And was there ever a mention of the famous Billy Goat Tavern games? And also, even though he was a newspaper columnist, do you have any recordings of Royko commenting on baseball?
Yeah, I'll start, and then we can, anyone else. Studs and Royko were very close friends. Royko was on Studs' show many, many times, probably one of the most frequent guests, and they had an incredible rapport. I'll suggest a partner archive of ours, which is a video archive called Media Burn, consists of Chicago-based video, and they have some fantastic footage of Studs and Royko, including a long passage of Royko in the Billy Goat Tavern, talking about Chicago softball and how it is to run a Chicago softball team, particularly when you're playing, you know, teams of cops and things like that. It's a great, if you want Royko's vision of Chicago softball in 20 minutes, it's pretty priceless.
Did Studs play the game?
No.
Is there any contact between Studs Terkel and George Ade? Because George wrote Fables and Slang, you know, in the 1900s.
Yeah.
And I think they would have intersected at some point, because I think Ade died in the 40s.
They did. Anyone else want to jump in, or I can say a few words about it? There is. I think there's one place, if I remember right, in the archive of Studs reading a George Ade story, and obviously just, you know, that whole generation of Chicago journalists from the 1890s and early 20th century were big influences for Studs as well. But not an interview with him in the archive. The radio archive begins in 1952, so he would have missed out in that way too.
So the Black Sox Scandal is almost 100 years old next year. What's like the most important thing to remember from it if you're not, say, like a baseball fan, or just like what's the takeaway from it? You know, almost 100 years on.
You know, for me, people are always you think Joe Jackson should be in the Hall of Fame, you know, and I always, you know, I feel like the same thing with Sammy Sosa and all of these things. When Roger Maris first, you know, it looked like he was gonna, you know, break Babe Ruth's record, and when Hank Aaron finally did, you know, they put an asterisk next to his record, saying, well, he played in more games, and it was a different game than everything like that. And I always feel like there should be, you know, whether it's O.J. Simpson or anything else, you don't take their records away, you put an asterisk next to him, you know, so Pete Rose, you know, great player. Personally, he's got the asterisk. For me, one of the fascinating things about the story was it was about corruption. And it reminded me originally of All the President's Men, of how people become corrupted and corrupt each other, and how many conspiracies don't work, and the ones that don't work are the ones where the people are a little bit ashamed of what they're doing, and they don't have enough meetings. So the Blacks had like two mass meetings about are we in or are we out and what we're doing. So there were guys who thought they were only going to throw one game, who were saying, what are we throwing this one or are we winning this one? Because they didn't have enough meetings. And I think what's fascinating, you know, about it is, yes, it was a labor situation, but they did also sell their own teammates out. They didn't let them in on it, and their teammates were trying to win. So it's you can't really make heroes of these guys, and some of them, like Joe Jackson, were just browbeat into it. You don't want to be the who, you know, messes us all up, do you, Joe? And you know, he was afraid of these guys. And then others did it because they were greedy. Some did it because they felt like they were right on the verge of being out of baseball. But how people become corrupted and accept a bad situation and don't fight against it in the right way. I think that's it's a nice little microcosm, just like it was, you know, with the Brooklyn Dodgers when Jackie Robinson, you know, played. There were guys who said, "Well, I'm not playing with him," and they ended up being like, "He's my teammate, and if you mess with him, I'm gonna punch you out." You know, human beings are. This is the essence of Studs. Human beings are strange and wonderful creatures. And and everyone's an individual, and you can't just say he's a, you know, Hispanic American in his 30s and therefore he thinks or is this. You got to talk to the guy and bring it out, and everybody's got their own story.
Any final questions?
And if not, maybe we can just run down the line if anyone up here has a final thought or comment or a notion to leave people with. So we can start on either side.
And you wanted to tell the story of Studs.
And I have to tell the story about Studs, yeah. In the meantime, can you bring up that photo of Studs that Bob and Laura went to? Yeah. So. But thoughts first? Derek, anything you wanted to throw out?
Nothing that prompts.
So just bring up a photo here. So I mentioned at the beginning of the program that Studs didn't get much chance to play baseball or other sports when he was young. And the photo that you're going to see here was taken on Studs' 90th birthday when he was invited to throw out the first pitch for the Chicago White Sox. And his neighbors, across the street neighbors, Bob and Laura Watson, bought him a baseball glove and a hat, and they got him the wrong hat, you'll see in just a moment. I never got the full story behind that. And they invited him to Laura in particular, the wife, invited him to play catch, I think just once, and Studs got such a thrill out of it that apparently then Studs would go back to Laura's house in the weeks leading up to across the street leading up to the game when he was throwing out the first pitch, and just knock on the door with his baseball glove in hand and say, "Is Laura home? Does she want to come play catch?" So as a 90-year-old, and there he is. Oh, he disappeared quickly. He was here in a flash. There he was. Well, come and gone. Oh, back again. So I think there's a certain beauty of the fact that what he missed out on in some ways as a kid, which is what led him into this love of radio and different kinds of music and being engaged in politics, listening to the presidential convention while he was, in this rest home as an 8-year-old, he did finally get to make up and play some catch and throw out the first pitch for the White Sox in 2002. So with that, we saw him for just a flash of a second, but maybe he'll come back. We'll see. He's the spirit of Studs is eluding us at the moment, but he'll be here. We can. There you go. That's perfect. So, yes. So, with that, we will thank you all. There'll be other events around the Studs Archive. We're doing something at the British Library in the fall, and lots more to come. And the podcast coming out in October called Bughouse Square. So, but above all, just go to studsterkel.org and you can find out all about everything that's happening. Thanks to the Library of Congress, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Chicago History Museum, and again, thanks to John and David, Derek, Allison and Matthew, and we'll stick around if you have personal questions. But thank you again for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.